There is indeed something that sum up a little bit, you know, the experience and the attitude, and a little bit, you know, it is something that it keeps coming up in these days lately with also many colleagues. Every time we, you know, talk about, you know, the workload and how daunted we had by so many things to do, in a way, Martin comes up, because when you went up to him to tell him your worries, he would answer, you know, saying, "My friend, you know, there is a limited amount of things you can do in a day," which in a way would automatically relieve you, you know, and make you feel good with what you've done in that day. And you know, so I think that's wonderful, you know.
There was something very, very funny about him. I think that is that every day he would greet you in the morning saying, "Good morning, my friend," or "How are you, my friend?" And he would sort of, at the end of the day, he would just say, "See you tomorrow, my friend." So it was this sort of expression that he used, sort of very, like a sort of gentleman in a way, you know. And he was, yeah, he was very, very, very funny. He was always very keen. He was always willing to talk about architecture. He would ask you, "Have you seen this project? Do you know these practitioners? Have you been here? Have you been there?" and so on. So he was very good as people, as someone to talk to. He was a great. I mean, he really mastered conversation in a way, and he was always sort of, you could feel this love for architecture and this interest.
He was honest, always a consummate professional, and I think probably one of the things is that when I talk about his honesty is that when you would have a conversation with him, he always told the truth. And if it was something that he didn't feel like he could quite say, you could always read it in his face. Yeah. And yeah, so it's fantastic. And I think that honesty is what made all the students and staff really, really love him.
My most recent memory of him is being at Design Engine and the celebration of his book. And he holds an audience beautifully. So he can hold 200 students in a lecture theatre, and he'll have them in the palm of his hand. And that was the same at the book launch. Martin could talk beautifully and eloquently, and everybody would be listening because what he had to say was always so beautifully put or kind of well thought through. And I think that's the quality of Martin, was that he thought carefully and crafted what he said and also what he did and how he was with people.
Well, Martin was very tech savvy, but he shared with me an active dislike for electronic invitations to meetings. So very occasionally we would have a kind of old gits get together by the kitchen sink and have a little rant about the loss of personal contact and the sense that we were being taken over by the world of electronics.
I think Martin was consistently Martin, and more recently we visited Martin on the Isle of Wight when our son was doing his veterinary experience at the Isle of Wight Zoo with lions and tigers, and we went and drank wine with Martin and had a lovely gentle chat, and saw him on the island in his place where he was extremely happy with his family. So yeah, that was the last time I saw Martin outside the school.
It was great seeing Martin laugh at stuff, and he laughed a lot at stuff because he found a lot of stuff funny. I do remember, this is very early on in my time here, but maybe, I don't know, a couple of years or so into working here. Students often, you know, tragically, you know, have sort of, you know, unfortunate circumstances befall them, get in the way of their work. And of course there's a mechanism for dealing with, we all know, we call it extenuating circumstances or ECF and all that. The way in which these were dealt with formally used to be much more long-winded. We had far fewer students then, so I guess we could spend more time on them. And I remember that, you know, it would happen a couple of times a year. There would be a meeting of what then seemed like a lot of staff to go through all of the students' problems. It's much more sort of streamlined now. Anyway, we're all sitting around a table going through things. It's all very confidential, but there's no denying that sometimes, you know, a student will come up with an issue that they filled out that is unfortunate, but frankly can be, you know, quite amusing as well. And I believe we were always professional about it, but one silly little thing came up where a student had said not been able to attend an assessment or whatever, and he said he'd had an operation on his knee, and it was the way he'd phrased it. I think the student might have actually written on the form, had an operation down on one knee, and I just sort of said without thinking, don't most people lie down for an operation? And it was a sort of silly quip that I'd said before I really thought about it. And I could hear a kind of strange noise, and I looked down the end of the table, and Martin was almost falling off his chair. He was weeping. The silly sod. It never occurred to me. I never intended to sort of bring out such raucous laughter. In fact, it didn't really amuse anyone else at all. But Martin was really tickled by that for some reason. And every now and then, ever since then, we've been able to sort of, we will have a, perfectly ordinary conversation just in passing. And one of us will say something, I really cannot think of any examples. And it will just sort of get us going with the giggles. It would.
I think for me, he was always hilarious. He always come up with surprising anecdotes or knowledge, and the architectural world and profession is very close. Everyone knows one another. But with Martin, although it was close, and we knew the same people and had the same conversations and interesting anecdotes about other people, actually, he was always very gently humorous. It was never an undermining humour about anybody.
I've kind of come to the conclusion that Martin was a bit like Kenneth Clarke. He was a kind of father of the school in the way that Kenneth Clarke was father of the House of Commons. And that's not something to do with age, it's something to do with the kind of gravitas and authority that he carried, but also his humility, unique qualities, and he's a big loss.